Welcome to True Diversity Film Series, Standing in Solidarity. My name is Donna Walker-Kuhn. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm Senior Advisor, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at New Jersey Performing Arts Center. This evening, our discussion is the power of Asian American and Black unity. In honor of Asian American Pacific Islanders Month, we are very pleased to host this important and diverse panel to provide insight and action steps on how we can support each other. The panel this evening was curated by Fordham University's AAPI Alumni Affinity chapter, and we thank you so much for all of your due diligence in putting together an amazing group of leaders. I also hope you were able to watch the film, American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs. That was provided for you in your registration link. This social justice series is part of NJPAC's Standing in Solidarity initiative. The purpose of this series is to bring our community together and to encourage everyone to take part in the movement to ensure civil rights for all. On our website, you can find archived prior social justice panel discussions, as well as resources that will help you take action. We're also happy to have as our advisors Newark NAACP, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Newark Arts, the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at Rutgers University, Newark, the Africana Institute at Essex County College, Asian American Arts Alliance, and ACLU New Jersey. Now, NJPAC would like to offer a land acknowledgement. And the language we're using was created in consultation and guidance from Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Munsee tribe and Oleana Whispering Dove of the Eastern Salagi Algonquin descendants. We're grateful to them for their generosity, wisdom, and labor to craft these words. We, the Lenape, original benefactors of land once ripened and cultivated with attentiveness to the Creator and her ascendancy, express everlasting gratitude to our Creator for the traditional ancestral jurisdictions of the Munsee, Esopus, Canarsie, Capsee, Werpros, Siwanoy, and Weekasqueak, jointly known today as the Ramapo and Natikote Lene Lenape. We are the Lene Lenape Hoking today and will be for the remaining days of tomorrow, keepers of the past. Let this moment of recognition be a monument of action. Let it be the beginning of hope for this, our Turtle Island, and for the Ramapo Lenape, the Munsee people of whose land we now trod. Here on this land, in this place of the Munsee, we acknowledge our debt to those who have come before us, to those who have been denigrated and suffered for the sake of cultural and land appropriation. Let this, our land acknowledgement, be the beginning of our return to unity. Let us be guardians of the water, the air, the earth, the four-legged, the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, the mammal people, and the green. Let us now stand lifting our humanity, enrapturing with Earth's consciousness as guardians of harmony and kindness. This acknowledgement demonstrates our ongoing commitment as community working to dismantle the continued legacies of colonialism, oppression, and systemic racism. And we offer a pledge of social justice awakening and education in order to raise the level of awareness and to ultimately strengthen the communal fabric, which includes engagement with our Indigenous neighbors. NJPAC would also like to thank our corporate sponsor, PSEG, for their support in our True Diversity film series, Standing in Solidarity. They have consistently provided resources over many years that enables us to produce this important work. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's discussion, Dr. Krish Sehgal. Dr. Sehgal is a licensed clinical psychologist and diversity, equity, inclusion expert who focuses on intersectionality. They facilitate intergroup dialogue, develop allyships in the workplace, and utilize best practices to develop and increase the multicultural counseling competency of individuals. They advocate for and work with young adults from marginalized backgrounds to help them navigate various isms and homophobia, transphobia, and the effects of these isms on their mental health. Welcome, Dr. Segal. We are so pleased to have you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. I'd like to welcome everyone to Stronger Together, the Power of Asian American and Black Unity. I'm really excited about moderating this panel of experts doing some amazing work with both Asian American and Black communities and building unity. We have an hour and a half, and there's a lot to talk about. And so I'm going to start off with introducing the panelists. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge Joanne Shu, who thought of and worked very hard to make this panel a reality. She curated this panel, has been working on it since the last year. Joanne is a graduate of Rutgers, New York's School of Social Work, and Fordham's Graduate School of Social Service at Lincoln Center. She's now an operations manager in a research lab at Northwell Health, addressing health equity. Now on to our panelists. Quan Blount-Hill, an assistant professor at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Before ASU, he obtained a law license, served as a KC, South Carolina firefighter, a Charleston, South Carolina police officer, an evaluation researcher for John Jay's Research and Evaluation Center, a research manager for New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and director of research for the Brooklyn Prosecutor's Office. His current research is focused on social narrative and group identity and the influence of identity on perceptions and experiences of justice. Judge Victoria Pratt, JD, was the former chief judge of the New York NJ's Municipal Court and nationally and globally known for her work to reform the criminal justice system. She is the executive director of Odyssey Impact, a nonprofit that uses storytelling through documentary films to galvanize social change. She's also the author of The Power of Dignity, How Transforming Justice Can Heal Our Communities, which was released to critical acclaim, and a viral TED Talk, How Judges Can Show Respect. Don Cao, Director, Chinese American Planning Council's Project Reach. Over 52 years ago, he founded one of the earliest Midwest Asian American student organizations and initiated a coalition of Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian, and progressive white students to protest the closing of the African American and Native American centers. 38 years ago, in an action unprecedented among race-segregated youth programs in New York City, he opened the doors of Project Reach in Chinatown to Black, Latinx, and Italian youth and put in place one of the most diverse and unique anti-discrimination agencies in the country. Kim Tran, PhD, is an award-winning activist, author, and consultant. Since 2014, Kim has trained thousands of people on police alternatives to community safety and uprooting anti-Blackness in Asian American families. She received the Outstanding Community Leader Award from the California Legislative LGBT Caucus in 2021. Her forthcoming book is titled, We Could Be, Searching for Justice After Diversity. So I thought we could start. Welcome, everybody. I'm just waiting for, I think we're having some technical difficulties with Judge Pratt's camera. Hopefully we'll be able to resolve that really soon. But I thought we could start with what we see happening in our communities and some personal examples of what we see and why this work of community building is so important. So.
Sure, I would love to kind of kick us off here. I think one of the most visible things we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic has been a really tense conversation about policing, particularly in Asian American ethnic enclaves. So if you're in Chinatown in Oakland, which is where I am, you'll see sometimes a heightened police presence. and then also a really strong pushback to that heightened police presence. And the idea is the kind of central theme is, what are we doing to keep Asian American communities safe? And there's this really obvious conversation and argument and debate that a lot of folks are having between, is community safety something that only applies to Asian Americans who don't experience police brutality in the same way as Black Americans, or is community safety about all of us, right? And so that is one of the most, I think, prominent, visible national issues that we see Asian American communities actively figuring out when it comes to what solidarity and what unity really looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Kwan?
Yeah, so I work in a university setting. And so one of the major debates that has been reflected in that setting, but I think is reflective across settings where groups are sometimes made to, go after some of the same resources, is what we mean by diversity, for instance, right? What we mean by who people of color are. And so things like, we have a diversity committee and we need to get more diverse student candidates, but are we focused on Black and brown folks? Or are we focused on people of Asian descent? And I think that that's been a conversation that I've seen now in my workplace in a university setting, but also I've seen in workplaces when we've talked about diversity in other settings as well. And even with regard to family members, friends, there's a conversation about who deserves the focus and the attention when we talk about lack and scarcity with regard to people of color, and whether Asian Americans are included in that or whether they are differentiated from those of us who are Black or maybe identify as brown.
Yeah. And I was reading recently, we've heard about Florida and erasure of Black history in the teaching of schools. And then recently there was an article on how Asian American history must be taught in Florida schools. And I find it really interesting how the two communities are so pitted against each other, right? And one community is erased, pitted by the larger establishment, so to speak, right? And what that does to creating unity and belonging and solidarity. So I'm curious about your thoughts on why are these challenges there? What makes it hard to work across differences?
Do you want me to go ahead and jump in the start?
Yeah, please.
So a lot of my research is on group psychology, right? And the kind of social psychology of group dynamics. And so when I think about an issue like this, I'm really thinking at an abstract level, but an abstraction that usually feeds into and is able to map onto the experiences at a more kind of like local or concrete level. And so I'm going to use myself kind of as an example. Now, all of us sitting here at this panel, all of us who are listening to my voice right now are a collection of identities, right? We're who we are, but we're a group or members of groups and stuff too. And so I'm Black, and so part of my identity is being Black. Part of my identity is being a university professor, for instance, or being a researcher, and that becomes really important. How that group is seen becomes really important. It becomes important because my group identity gives me a sense of belonging. So because I know that I'm Black, because I'm tied to Black culture and the Black group identity, it means that when I go off on a hike in Utah and see some other Black dude on the mountain with me, like we make eye contact and head nod and say, yeah, we're both here. So we have some commonality here. There's somebody here who has my back. It makes me feel good when Black people do good, right? For instance, having President Barack Obama to turn to as an example of Black success makes me feel good about the possibilities of what I can do. It brings a sense of social support and people who I can lean on, people who can work with me to accomplish goals. And so group identity is really, really important. But what that means is that when group identity becomes super important, especially in contexts where that group identity is like the major identifier. For instance, on a panel where you talk about race, I'm immediately aware of my race because that's something that's in the air, is what people are focused on. Then it also causes me to think about a number of things with regard to how my group is positioned to other groups. And so inevitably, for instance, you're going to have instances of in-group favoritism where I want to make sure maybe that the Black folks on the panel look really good and are speaking really well because I want people to associate Blackness with articulation. You have this sense of group comparison, right? So I want to make sure that the Black panelists are doing particularly well when you compare them against the other group on the panel because I don't want the Black group to be seen as less capable, right? We all kind of do this almost without thinking of it, right? And bias in some cases against the out, right? So maybe I'm even more scrutinizing of those who are not part of my group in a way that helps to protect the identity of the group. And you can think about how you think about even yourself in comparison to others, right? You often compare yourself to others. And so you do the same thing with regard to group identity. The last thing I'll say though is that this tends to be enhanced in a couple of circumstances that find themselves often in articulation here in the United States, which is in instances of structural scarcity, right? Where it's like resources are few and those people have to go for just the few resources that are there. So I gave the example, for instance, of diversity within the university setting, where we only allow a few spots for diverse candidates, right? And there's a much higher likelihood that, say, white candidates get all the rest of those spots. You can still get the non-diverse candidate spots, but it's less likely. And so all the diverse candidates are fighting for those slots to make sure that they get an opportunity to be a part of the university system, the university atmosphere. And that pits groups who rely on diversity set-asides against each other, right? And so in that case, you're going to have an enhanced sense of competition. And also anytime that there's a group threat, right? Anytime that there's some sort of threat to the group's identity, its safety, its resources. So a lot of discussions, for instance, about Stop Asian Hate, when they seem to be contextualized or talked about in the sense of Black people being some of the offenders of those hate incidents, that immediately sets me on edge to think about, well, wait a minute, I don't want people thinking Black people are the cause. I don't want to increase policing of Black folks in Asian communities, for instance. And so all these things become really, really important phenomena that kind of impact how we look at group dynamics. I'll stop there.
So yes, Judge Pratt, please.
I wanted to talk about how our use of language, and while Don is our historian on the call, the use of language to pit the two groups against one another, and how it also helps us forget the history of the groups. And so when we talk about the internment of the Japanese, we are really talking about the incarceration of an entire group of people because of their race, even though they were Americans, and that this whole idea that Americans because they were connected to or considered an other. And then when we look at what's happened to African Americans and continues this wholesale incarceration of a group of people, and we forget that it's incarceration where it's the government coming in and stripping people of their rights. When we look at the rails as they were built, first the Japanese and then the Chinese were brought in to replace, and we look at people who were recruited to do rails in the country. However, African Americans were incarcerated to build the rails in this country on the chain gangs. And so how those things begin to undermine relationships between a group of people historically, not understanding that neither one of them was in control of the situation that created it. And how language is used to really shift the reality and the truth of situations, and to kind of build this well of misinformation and mistrust and inequality amongst groups of people. And so always being very careful that we are listening with two ears, or looking for a deeper truth around how we talk about people, and how subsequently, again, looking at another group who was incarcerated and received reparations. And then you have another group that's like, well, we still haven't been able to do that, and how that underlying animosity builds, and forgetting the history of all the coalition building that I know Don will talk a lot about later on.
Yeah.
Should I say something? I'm not so sure. I'm old, but I don't think I'm necessarily a historian. Uh, and just so you don't have to do any guessing, I'm going to be 72 this year. So it's interesting. Just hearing everybody talking and I want to just pose a situation where Project Reach, where I work, we do anti-discrimination training. And so we were called in to address anti-Asian violence in a gifted and talented middle school in Harlem. Okay, so I thought, Harlem, gifted and talented. Interestingly, when we go there, there are very few Black and brown children in the school. Most of the children are South Asian or East Asian or white. And so I thought, so my stereotype, and I'm not supposed to stereotype, was, oh, the white kids must be doing the anti-Asian violence. Well, it wasn't. It was actually the South Asian students against the East Asian students. And the Black and brown children, the few that were there, would then jump on the bandwagon. And then the N-word became prolific and okay, because apparently the Black students weren't targeted. So it's just interesting to see how layered. I mean, we all look at the wedges that have been driven between the Asian and the Black community, or any number of other groups. But nobody looks at the root cause. And nobody ever talks about white supremacy. It's like, oh, what is that? We're talking about Black and Asian solidarity, but nobody looks at white supremacy and white privilege. And it has nothing to do with the race of white folks, but it has everything to do with the values and mores and stereotypes and misinformation and lack of history that ends up having everybody believe the stereotypes because we were never taught the history.
Yeah.
And that becomes really problematic. And so I shared something with Krish earlier, a quote. Are we able to show it?
I don't think so, but if
Okay,
you,
that's all right.
you know the quote by heart, or I can read it out.
Why don't you read it out? This is I've always been wondering, like, how did this all happen? And I know that when I was growing up, I wanted to be white before I was 18. Okay. What may shock people also was that I was a Republican and I was for the Vietnam War for all the reasons that the media and everybody was putting out, right? Freedom and liberty for all. We're stopping the communists, on and on and on. It wasn't until I went to college and found out that there was a lot of stuff I didn't know. And in doing my research, I ran across this quote. Do you want to read it, Krish?
Yep. At a time, and this is in quotes, at a time when Americans are awash in worry over the plight of racial minorities, one such minority, America's 300,000 Chinese Americans, is winning wealth and respect by dint of its own hard work. And there's a gap. And when it is being proposed that hundreds of billions be sent to uplift Negroes and other minorities, Chinese Americans are moving ahead on their own with no help from anyone else, end quote.
So we use this in one of our exercises to just see what people's reactions are. And every decade, or when I first did this 40 years ago, all the Asians were going, oh, that's right. You know, we're really hardworking, blah, blah, blah. and of course, many Black folks also would say, oh, you know, it must be true. But what people don't realize is that this quote came from March 1966. Most people who have not learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act didn't realize that from 1882 until 1965, Chinese couldn't even come into this country. Japanese were kept out from 1924, and Filipinos were then excluded in 1934. So an entire race pretty much has been excluded from coming into this country. So when an immigration law changes in 1965, it takes 3 years for people to start immigrating. So how is it that this media promotes Asians as being the successful model minority when they haven't even gotten back into the country yet?
Mm.
So it begs the question, who wrote this article? Was it the
Can
Asians?
I,
Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
I'd love to add a little bit to the I think phenomenal wisdom that Dawn brings to this panel. And I just want us to think about what it means to be an invisible community of color in America. Just for a second, I'm going to tell you what that looks like. And so there are a lot of interesting questions happening in the chat and in the Q&A, and I want to address a couple of them because there are assumptions that are made based on like what's inside of these questions. And one of the things that we see a lot of within Asian American communities is the erasure of our relationship to other communities of color. I think like Judge Pratt was saying, we're talking about the railroads, we're talking about a group of laborers that was actually brought into the country in order to sow division between Black folks and white folks. Asian Americans weren't enslaved Africans, but they certainly weren't free white laborers. And so they were kind of in this indentured place, right? And since we were brought to this country, that has been the relationship that we have had. It's this erased kind of model minority part that completely invisibilizes the actual plight of being Asian American. And I don't think we actually need to go all the way back to the Page Act. We can just think about the fact that Asian Americans are a racial community in America that has the largest racial wealth gap of any community of color. So in one community, you will have South Asian women who out-earn white men, but also people like me who are Vietnamese. I make the same as a Black woman in terms of my pay gender gap. 63 cents on the dollar, folks. I'm a Vietnamese woman. Are we ever talking about me? My story, being working class, being raised by a single mom, a mom who was a union member. I am an organizer and I have been one since I was 3 years old. You don't hear my story. You see Crazy Rich Asians on TV, and then there's this assumption that we all look like model minorities, that we all have tremendous amounts of formal education. And then all that's lost is the fact that Asian Americans, we call ourselves Asian Americans, because we wanted to build coalition with Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks. That's where Asian American came from. It's not a census category. It's something that activists decided on in the 1960s, right? You don't see that. And then what we do actually fixate on is things like, oh, Asian and Black tension in Chinatown, Black folks perpetrating anti-Asian violence. But 75% of the anti-Asian violence since 2019 has been perpetrated by white people. But the viral videos are the same thing we see in media depictions of Black folks, right? That's what it looks like to be erased as a group, as a community of color. And that is actually how division works.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, earlier when I was talking to Don, when we were talking about this quote, he had actually said something really interesting, which is which Asian identities, which Asians get seen and made visible, and which Asian identities get made invisible or erased, right? As part of this model minority myth. And I really liked the notion that Dawn had put forward in one of our conversations of, is it a model minority or a manipulated minority? Right? Because what you both are talking about is how a community was manipulated and pitted against Blacks and African Americans in order to serve white supremacy. And so we don't talk about white supremacy. We just talk about amongst ourselves and fight.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I find so deeply troubling is that when we talk about solidarity, we tend to fixate on the 60s and the 70s and the coalition building that happened there. But since 2014, Asians for Black Lives has started chapters across the country, and they are systematically doing solidarity work with Black American communities in the Twin Cities, in Southern California. In Los Angeles, you have Koreatown for All, and that's predominantly Asian Americans doing anti-Blackness work in their own community. And so that idea of manipulated minority, I really love, because I think it's not even just manipulated externally, it's also what we think of ourselves. If we stop thinking about ourselves as people who are capable of political action, who are alone in taking this kind of action, it starts to feel really alienating to do. And when you understand that you've got history at your back and you have organizations in front of you doing this work, it's so much more like obvious as a political horizon, right?
Mhm.
I like that we're talking about this idea of white supremacy, and that white supremacy is about protecting privilege and maintaining your position. And so when we talk about manipulating stories, and again, language around what the narrative is, we're looking at this pending Supreme Court case about affirmative action and this whole history around forgetting that Asians fought for affirmative action early on, had to. And once they began to dominate these elite schools that were preserved for the white elite, they were labeled overrepresented. And so this idea of flushing Asians out by just not letting them in the schools.
Mhm.
And now someone has captured this narrative and said, oh, no, it's not, we're not keeping you out the school. It's those unqualified Black folks. So let's turn the narrative on to them. And that we play this game. There's a Supreme Court that's willing to hear it and push this narrative forward, and how dangerous it is, because once again, pitting these groups against one another, but that the Black and brown children who are really going to suffer as a result of this hijacking of the narrative of what's really happening, and that these are not places that were intended for us to go to and to be and to use, and so again, once again, protecting white supremacy, protecting privilege, protecting things that we were not supposed to have a part of. And I don't hear anyone screaming about this when we have these conversations about what this talk is about affirmative action. Because when you go into a lot of these affirmative action programs, you'll see predominantly white women, and you'll see a large number of Asian people. So again, where are the Black students who were supposed to, and the Latina students who were supposed to, I'm so sorry, but we're supposed to also have a part of this and also be able to change their life's trajectory as a result of it. But it's this game of, oh, no, it's not us, it's them. So figuring out how we can recapture the narrative so that we are not, again, the losers in there, or the next generation of young people are not the losers in this.
I think,
Oh.
go ahead, Don, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that it's also really important to understand that white supremacy not only erases our histories, but it just omits it altogether. And so what people don't realize is that, why is it that some Asians, we should say, but everybody sees all Asians are doing better on the SATs. Of course, now they're getting rid of the SATs, thank God. But anyway, that, white Asian students are doing better than white students on the SATs. And nobody wants to look at the impact of, in 1966, when you promote a group that hasn't even come back into the country as being the model minority, then what do the guidance counselors and the educators do from that point on? Well, what they do is they track the Asians into academics, even more so than they do whites. They track the Black and brown folks. If they even track them into educational programs, it's usually vocational or lower paying, unskilled areas. And then nobody wants to look at the difference economically in terms of what's going on in the Asian community versus the Black community. And one thing I don't mean to simplify it, but I often ask people, what's the Chinese community that everybody knows about? Oh, it's Chinatown. What's the Black community? Of course, now I'm showing my age. Everybody, I'd say Harlem, but Harlem is no longer Black, with all the gentrification. But when you look at those two things, what's the major difference? Chinese own all their own businesses in their community. Black people have never been allowed to own their businesses because of redlining, right? The only places it happened was in Rosewood or in Tulsa. And what happened there? It was separate but equal. And as soon as something happened that was perceived to be against the white community, they burned all of that capital and all that success. And people don't even realize it. I was sharing with Chris earlier, and I just learned this 4 years ago, and I've been studying this history, that over 1,000 people, Black men, after 1865, and actually after Juneteenth, which is 2 years later, over 1,000 Black men were actually elected into public office. Some in the federal government, but many in the South. But nobody wanted to look at the history of the KKK, which started also in 1865. And every time Black men were lynched, nobody did anything about it. And so by 1877, you find almost no Black people running for public office, because the system, the institutional system, the government had no interest in protecting the rights of Black folks who are actually making something for themselves. And it's just horrific. And you wonder why, everybody's going, well, why is it that, affirmative action was supposed to be helping Black folks, but it's really not helping, because this is all compensation for free labor for over 400 years. And nobody wants to look at that, and anyway, I'll stop there. It's just too many other things to talk about.
Can I, building off of that though, Don, one of the things that I think is also important to talk about is the ways in which that kind of story and that narrative go hand in hand with the ways that societies are structured, so that they're structured to reinforce each other and in some ways become almost a construction of reality. So for instance, if you come in, say as an immigrant to the country, right, you're likely to go into an immigrant enclave, but much of what you hear about people beyond that enclave will have already been constructed, possibly before you even come into the country. And oftentimes, definitely when, but at the time that you get here, right? And so then when you have segregation as structured within societies, and you have segregation both with regard to residents, but also with regard to the types of work that people are funneled in, or the ways in which they interact with each other. It creates, again, an opening where much of what you learn, you're actually getting from like the outside, majority and dominant culture. But when that dominant culture is structured in a way, not only to have certain things be physically in place with regard to the structure of society, or even procedurally in place with regard to the processes of society, but also ideologically in place, and from the sense of a meta or cultural narrative, then all of that kind of reinforces itself to socialize the various groups into how they should think, not just about each other, but also about themselves. If you step back and start thinking about how often group-based narratives, group-based stereotypes impact how you think about even yourself, how many, for again, use myself as an example, how many times I have an understanding of like what it is supposed to mean to be Black, and how many times I sometimes can slip into thinking about myself within those terms. Oh, okay, there's like, we're having fun times here, so now like I'm about to like get up and dance on the dance floor because that's what people expect of me. They want me to be like kind of the fun guy. And the amount of times that I did that as a younger person, because in multicultural groups, that was going to be the thing that got me some cachet, right? And that's what everybody expected. And so I think it is important to think about that narrative and how deeply embedded it can be, both with regard to how our reality seems to reflect that, right? Oh, okay, I don't know much about Black people, say if I'm Black, or I don't know much about Asian people, and the only thing I know are these sources of information, and they're consistently set up to reify that. And then the world that you go into after that is consistently set up to restructure or is structured such to support that.
Go ahead, Kim, and then we'll move on from this. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just want to share something that affirms Kwan's point. So every day I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? I go into an organization and we talk about the ways that stereotypes are different depending on the community of color that you're from. So for Asian women, it's going to be you're passive and you're submissive and you don't have leadership potential. And for a lot of Black women, it's going to be you're too aggressive, you're too assertive, we're going to penalize you with a performance improvement plan or something like that. But when I have these conversations with folks, And I asked them about whether or not they have experienced firsthand some of the racial antagonisms that we're talking about. They'll often actually say, oh, I haven't, right? But there's this idea that's really powerful. And you start to police each other and yourself based on the idea that you've seen, right? So I just went to a tech organization of about, I don't know, there are about 100 people in this office. And we were having this conversation about anti-Blackness and anti-Asian sentiment in both of our communities. And there's a Black queer facilitator, an Asian facilitator, and me. I'm a queer Asian woman. And I said, tell me about when you have experienced some of these stereotypes from, you know, Asian Americans, or for the Asian person, I said, tell me when a Black person has, you know, clearly reflected some of these beliefs. And they both looked at me and said, I've actually never experienced that before. I was like, okay, so what are we working with here? What exactly are we working with here? Because that shows me the power of the idea. That's how powerful that stuff is. They paid a whole bunch of money to have a facilitator come in and talk about this idea that actually very few people in the room had ever experienced. And we have to work with that as something real, because the idea creates material consequences. It creates anti-Blackness, it creates xenophobia, but also understand that this stuff comes from somewhere, and it's an incumbent upon us to really uproot it at a very personal and also community level.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you're talking about, as an immigrant to this country, I can distinctly remember the messages I got about Black folks, right? And who to associate with. And there's this expectation that if you want to fit into white society, right, you will learn this secret hierarchy, and it's not so secret, right? So when Dawn talked about wanting to be white, I was thinking also of, oh my God, I'm just blanking out on this, on her name, this Black comedian who is also on The View. She had this whole skit on wanting long blonde hair, right? When she had first started out. Yes, Whoopi Goldberg, thank you. And it's so powerful, right? A lot of immigrants, right? Speaking to what Kwan was also talking about, a lot of immigrants learn that to fit in, you have to buy into these hierarchies. And so it takes a real conscious effort to kind of unlearn this. So I want to switch the conversation because, you know, watching Grace Lee Boggs, the movie, I think what I was struck by was how little exposure she had to Black folks, became immersed in the community, unlearned, and then learned so much and became a key part of the movement in Detroit, right? And such a huge part, and continued to do the activism work till she died. It just changed flavors. So how, you know, what I'm asking is, I think, two parts. One is, how do we get there? Like, so, you know, there's a long history of collaboration between our communities. And I know, you know, so how did folks do that? And where do we go from here? So let's start with the first part. How did those, you know, let's talk about the collaborations that have happened, because I don't think we know our own history so much. Dawn, Judge Pratt, Kim, Kwan?
I'll talk a little bit about this. This is actually a lot of my research. There are a couple of really powerful stories when it comes to Asian American solidarity with Black folks. I'll do the classic history thing, and then I'll move forward to the present. I think the most famous one is the relationship that Thich Nhat Hanh had with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? So Dr. King learned about nonviolence, and that came from South Asian communities. That form of particular Kingian nonviolence that we talk about now is a South Asian import. And then there was also a lot of respect and admiration for Thich Nhat Hanh as a faith leader who was against the American war in Vietnam, as Dr. King was, right? And so I think that is the most prominent example. Then you have people like Grace Lee Boggs. You had the relationship that Yuri Kochiyama had with Malcolm X. Yuri Kochiyama actually held Malcolm X's head as he died after he was assassinated. And so those are like our real big, obvious examples. And then I think, you know, there are a lot quieter examples that I personally find equally powerful. So after Hurricane Katrina in Eastern New Orleans, you had Vietnamese and Black folks band together to fight environmental racism in their community. And that was really powerful. Also in the same region, in the Gulf, you had Vietnamese fishermen band together with Black folks against the Ku Klux Klan. And so there are all of these like quieter examples too, like Asians for Black Lives, like Koreatown for All, that we just don't know about. And we kind of refuse to see as a country because we actually don't want to see Asian Americans in a more multidimensional way than as model, right? We've made oddly racism something that belongs to Black folks. And then we've said Black folks are the people who fight racism. That's a very lonely proposition for one group of people. And it's deeply unfair. And so when you start to visualize the history, and also I like to just say the present, there's a lot more possibility.
Judge Pratt,
I'm sorry, I wanted to talk about something that Kim,
Yes.
I was just telling a story recently that a couple of years ago, I had gone into a store and someone had there was a guy working in the store, he stuttered, and a white woman had said to him, asked him a question, but he's a stammerer, so it took him a long time to get it out. He was Latino, and she yells out loud, does anyone speak English in this store? And I give it to her. And I'm yelling, how dare you? And clearly, if you had waited, and how dare you say, and I'm giving it to her on like not 10, but on 15. And now she's embarrassed because she didn't think anybody was going to call her out, but I don't play that. And there was a young Asian woman who met me, and like I had to walk in the supermarket, and she came up to me. She was like, I'm glad you said something to her. And I said to her, your people don't speak English either, so you should have said something to her. And so this weight that as an African American, constantly having the responsibility to call out white supremacy, to call out these things, not just for us, but for everyone. Because I know that if a racist, if a white supremacist is not checked, it's really going to be bad for me and for Black people. And so this constant need to be the person on the front line, and then, you know, obviously you become the angry Black woman, and I was on that day. But this idea of really, I said it to the young woman because she had a responsibility to not let that go. Not because she spoke English, and not because he was Latino and the person assumed he didn't speak English, but because when someone behaves that way, it's not safe for anyone. And so standing up and constantly having to stand up for these issues. And so when you talked about historically about relationships, I want to talk more presently about, you know, the communities that I live in, the communities where Asians serve Blacks, live and work in the communities with us. And so when you see this violence, it's shocking because it's where we go, it's where we eat, you know, who you allow to feed you. You know, it's the Indian Muslim brother that when I was teaching, I had to remind my students that, well, in my community, we call Muslims, my Muslim brother, the Muslim sister. And so when you turn it and you say that that these folks are now our enemies, it doesn't make sense to us in that space, and that we can't discount that part of it either. And so sometimes, you know, looking high picture, but where do you go to eat during the course of the day? Where do you go to shop? Who is willing to be in community with us? And it's Asians and Blacks who work and live and who are in this space. So while the narrative is crazy, this is still, you know, how we live and where we go.
Yeah. And Judge Pratt, you're right. I have survived and thrived in this country. I would not have gotten my PhD if it were not for these African-American women who took me under their wing, right? They helped me make sense of the racism I was experiencing, the xenophobia, gave me language for it, and kind of motivated me to do DI work, right? They taught me everything. And so I do try and speak up, but I think there is an extra burden that Black folks carry. But that's been true of this country historically, right? The Black folks have always carried the burden of this country, and currently also.
I think, Chris, you had asked earlier, one of the questions was, where do we go from here and what do we do now? And I want to really honor what both you and Judge Pratt said a second ago, which is we share space. Our community shares space. The reason that thing in New Orleans worked with Southeast Asian folks and Black folks was because they shared a city. And the environmental racism they were going to experience was going to impact both of them. And so the thing that I think we need to really do is, you can start with diversity, equity, inclusion, and I'm not saying don't do it. I do. It's my day job. I do it every day. Yes, and think a lot more strategically and a lot closer to the vets. I've been in abolition work for a very long time, and I want to know if you feel comfortable going to your neighbor's house and knocking on the door when they're being loud instead of calling the police. That's what I want you to be able to do. I want you to put up flyers in your neighborhood that are for firefighters instead of police for emergency response. I want you to have a conversation with someone who lives nearby. And if you are, as an Asian American person, afraid to go to Chinatown, as so many of us were during the pandemic, we were targets for violence, right? And this was the first time that I had ever actually been afraid of just white people on the street. Like I grew up in a very multiracial place. There were only 30% of my town was white people. I did not grow up around a bunch of white folks. And so this was the first time in my life where I was like, oh, this is actually really scary, because I'm no longer in a multiracial community where these folks are rare. I'm in a community where there are a lot more white folks. And 75% of the time, it's going to be a white person attacking an Asian American, right? If that is you and you are afraid, I want you to be able to walk to Chinatown, to the store, what have you, with a friend, with a neighbor, with a community member, as opposed to calling the cops, right? Because when we think about racial justice is a project that we all do. And the thing that we have to start actually doing is connecting with each other. This stuff is built through relationships. Who are the relationships? What are the relationships you have, and who are they with?
I just want to say, I've been doing this work so long, and when people came up with this phrase DEI, I'm going, what the hell are you talking about? We've been doing DEI for 40 years and nobody cared, right? What I realized is that and I'm thinking, Judge Pratt, about your example about the Asian woman, and I'm just thinking, part of the problem is that white supremacy has established the very ways in which we don't talk to one another, and we stay away from each other. And it's only once in a while that maybe something leaks over. So for example, no matter where I go in the United States, whether it's in rural area or even in the city, sometimes I'll catch the glance of a man of color, a Black man, and he'll nod to me and I'll nod back. And I don't know what causes that, that pathway to be there, but it normally wouldn't be. But I also feel that if we don't share examples of history with our children, that they won't see that that's a possibility. So for example, how many of you knew that in 1903, there was a union of sugar beet workers, Japanese workers and Mexican workers, okay? And they went to Samuel Gompers, as for some of you who don't know, Samuel Gompers is the big white guy who's the father of the labor union, but nobody knew he was a racist. He would not charter this union, this independent union, because Japanese were in it. He was willing to let Mexicans be in it, but not Japanese. And it was because of the Mexican secretary of the union who wrote him back a letter saying, we're not gonna split up, from our Japanese brothers who have worked side by side, in adverse conditions. And they formed their own independent union and bucked up against what would later become the AFL-CIO, which was kind of honored as the, premier, labor, whatever. But we don't share those examples, or we don't know where our people have come together. And oftentimes when I'm doing this workshop around the history of racism, I tell people, don't just think skin color. Every time you think about, skin color, they talk about black and white. And I grew up never feeling like racism existed. I was just a foreigner. Didn't matter. I was just a foreigner. And that's another form of whatever. But I tell people, think about land, labor, and drugs. Land, labor, and drugs. And when you think about it across the board, whether it's Native American, indigenous people, Black folks, Mexican folks, Asian folks, people of color across the board have always economically been robbed of land, brought in as laborers, and drugs were used to basically quell any form of change or resistance or revolution. And people don't look at those factors and how those factors intersect. We've got to look at a lot of different kinds of intersection because it speaks to why our communities have become so disempowered. And I'm surprised, quite honestly, Judge Pratt, that Asian woman even approached you, but I'm glad she did. And for her, that was the beginning. That was the beginning. And at Project Reach, everybody used to get very angry at us because since 1985, we were all Chinese gang youth. And we opened our doors to the Black, Latino, and Italian youth who lived in the projects right around Chinatown. And everybody was going, what the hell are you doing? Nobody realized that New York City was not only the most diverse city in the world, it was the most segregated city in terms of services. And we just stuck to our guns. And as a result, we have people from different racial communities who never would have shared a story with each other because they slept in the different neighborhoods. They maybe schooled together, but other than that, they went back to their own communities. So until we consciously move people together and engage them in stories that always challenge stereotypes, always challenge history, we're not, we've got a lot of work to do.
Don, if I could jump on something that you talked about with Asian gangs and Black gangs. I do work at Pelican Bay in California in prisons. And the one thing that shocked me were the large number of Asian men in the prisons. And I got there and my jaw dropped. I mean, there were Chinese Bloods. There were Chinese gang members, people who had gotten enhancements because, again, they were in gangs. And what wasn't surprising to me, but that what we forget is that the gangs offered them the same things that they offered the Black dudes who were in the gangs, the same thing that offered the Latino guys who were in the gang. It's first the distrust of the police that are there to protect you. It starts with that, right? Family, protection, love. And so when we look at these things and we're focused on this other stuff, we forget that, again, we're incarcerating a group of people because our system itself is broken. It's broken. And we just continue to perpetuate this because we want to be focused on, there's because white supremacy gets you focused on the wrong thing. Exactly. It keeps you focused on the symptoms and not the problem. And so I was just really shocked. There was like, it's the same thing. And because it's in California in large numbers, I mean, one young man who was there because he was Chinese and the two families owned a Chinese restaurant and someone stole. And instead of going to the police to tell them and filing charges, they went to the house to get the stuff. And, he ends up in prison because they took matters into their own hand because in their community, the police do not resolve issues in that way for them. And so they felt they had no other choice. And I just really thought like, wow, we are so behind the 8 ball if we are not doing something about these things.
I wanna highlight what you're saying, Judge Pratt, because the surprise of communities of color when you talk about incarcerated Asian Americans says a lot about what we expect Asian Americans to be as a country. Right. So for the last 20 or so years, my family has been working with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated men at San Quentin prison out here. And this is one of those things where I think folks imagine it's like a very small community. of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Asian Americans, but it's quite large. And I think when you buy into the model minority, you actually miss all of the opportunities we have to share common ground around the fact that incarceration hurts all of our communities, right? Their families, like there's so much joy in abolition. My mom just threw a party for a man that was released last month, and his family was there. All of the men he knew inside who'd been released came, and they broke bread together. And I thought there's so much joy in abolition, and it's joy that we share as a community, but it's also joy that we can share with each other across racial lines, right? And so we have such a tremendous opportunity if we plain and simply open our eyes to what that looks like. If you look for your people, they will be there. If you look for a diverse Asian American experience, Asian Americans fighting incarceration, we are here. We want to work with you. We need bodies on the line. And so it's really just a matter to me always of asking for a different story to be told about not just my community, but everyone. Right. So a Black community that's not defined by incarceration, and an Asian American community that isn't defined by academic success.
Well, if I can say, I mean, one of the things as I'm hearing this that I think about, you know, I'm always thinking about things in like a more abstract way, but ways that can be applied to a bunch of different places, both big and small, historical and present. And so a lot of the times in the context where we have intergroup conflicts or where groups are, you know, kind of separated, I mean, research, right, has shown us that there are some like pretty time-honored strategies for bringing groups together. And so I just really wanted to take some time to just say that, quick time, right, which is like what everyone's talking about, this idea of like convergence of interests is like a classic way for people to come together to realize that, oh, wait, your group has some of the same concerns my group has. Oh, we should join together and deal with those concerns. So now all of a sudden we're not in competition, we're both in the same league, right? Like going towards the same goal. And so like that is actually what allows you to have this sense of sympathy, right? The sense of being able to understand and see somebody as yourself and as having common interests with you. But then another strategy is actually to highlight ways in which actually those two groups are really part of similar groups, same groups. Sometimes, for instance, if you focus not on the fact that you're Asian and I'm Black, but actually we both live in my neighborhood, I live in Greenwich Village. So like when bad stuff happens here, actually a lot of that bad stuff, some of it is just because I'm Black and it'll impact me differently than you. But in some cases, actually it's just like, if you happen to be walking down the street and this bad thing is happening in Greenwich Village, it's gonna happen to you and me if we're both walking down that street. Really, we both live here in this village, right? And so that's part of our identity. In fact, that identity in many cases may be the more important identity than some of these other identities, right? And so looking at all the ways in which it's like, oh wait, actually we're all panelists right now. Like that's really what we're doing, is trying to make an engaging and educational experience for all of you. So right now I'm actually focused on working with all of my panelists. I'm not really concerned about their different racial groups because I want to make sure that this event is a success. How many times in your life are you actually defining yourself in racial terms when in fact other identities are just as important, are identities that would bring us together? And those are, again, a classic strategy for getting those intergroup tensions to reduce. But one thing I really want to highlight is one way to also reduce intergroup tension, and really to reduce a lot of interpersonal tension, is actually to just reduce competition in general. Like if we didn't have set-asides for groups, and like also we have very limited ability for anybody to go to universities at all. If like it was easier for everyone to go to universities, then I wouldn't compete with you as much, right? If there were more jobs and like we worked on having more jobs, I wouldn't have to compete with that. If the United States didn't have such a massive wealth gap as a society, then it'd be a lot more wealth spread around, and I wouldn't be as jealous of you because the gap between you and I wouldn't be as big. And so the more we spend time focusing on reducing structures of power, that centralized power, structures of oppression that create artificial and arbitrary distances, we have an opportunity to actually create an environment which allows for a lot more coming together. In fact, embraces us being able to see each other as individuals, because we, have to rely less on teams to help get whatever we need to get in a case of artificial scarcity.
So
I love that because
Kim, I'm sorry. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We have a question in the chat, and that actually ties into what I had wanted. If someone can just really briefly talk about intersectionality, because that's something we've just focused on race, right? But race intersects with other aspects of our identity. One, you kind of reference social class and economics, right? All that, I think, also creates intra-group conflict. So after COVID, I think a lot of folks with disabilities have spoken up about access to resources and things like that. And so that's something that actually doesn't get addressed when we talk about race, because we are not also just monoracial, right? That's just one aspect of our identity. And when we look at disability, for instance, we are all tabs, temporarily able-bodied. We are all going to develop some form of disability as we age, as we get older, and develop limitations. And so that's something we don't talk about. We also don't talk about folks who are multiracial, right? Folks who are Black and white, or Black and Asian, or any other combination, right? Where for various reasons. So I was speaking to someone who identifies as Blasian because of colorism, experienced discrimination from her Asian family, and was exoticized by the Black side. And so I think, and now that I'm looking at the time, actually, we don't have time to get into it, but I just want to highlight this, that we really don't, we need to take also a more complex look at identities, right? And how we show up in the world, and how we respond to others and how they show up, right? What assumptions we make about people. So given the time, I'd just like to ask each panelist to talk about maybe next steps or action items you would like the audience to leave with. Give you 2 minutes each, right, to solve all the problems.
Don, are you going first? That you signal you want to? I thought you were going to say something. I'll jump in here. I'll be real quick. I would say 2 things that I want to leave you with. Is one, we've had a very interesting and very thoughtful conversation. I would encourage as much as possible for panelists and everyone listening to us to not externalize this problem that we're talking about, to try to figure out how much of the change you want to see you can be, to play with that common tropey kind of phrase, and to really figure out like how it is that you yourself may perpetuate some things, or to the extent you don't do that, that you may yourself in your own life, in whatever small ways or big ways, that you are combating this division. And lastly, as you think about that, remember the fact that like big problems are usually made of small problems, right? And so it is all these little things of like, oh, I decided I didn't want to go to this restaurant because I walked in there and there weren't enough of me, or there were too many of them, right? Those small little decisions in aggregate form a lot of the big divisions that we're looking at. So I would also encourage us to look at how even small things that we can do to bridge gaps can be really important to bridge these larger like societal and community gaps that we're talking about.
Thank you, Kwan. That was really efficient. Who's next? Don?
I'm not quite sure where to start. I think about
2 minutes.
okay. I think it's interesting that because I know the bios of all of you, having read them kind of late, but I think I did not think that there would be many LGBT folks on this panel, and I think we're an overwhelming majority. So at least from what I saw in the bios, and of course other folks, well, everybody got to see our bios, right? And it's interesting. I think because of all the intersections of my life, I can't let go of any of them. And so right now I started off with a staff that was all Chinese. back in 1985. And then we diversified and we became Black, Latino, Arab, all different groups. And now my entire staff is some form of non-binary, trans, bisexual, whatever. And we didn't recruit that way. But it's interesting that when we go into schools, we thought we would maybe be, we're not an LGBT program, by the way, but we thought we might not be allowed to get into schools if they found that out. And we're finding out that children are so much more open to gender, variation, to sexuality, to a lot of other things. And a lot of times it's around those other identity areas that they come together. And it allows us to then take advantage of getting people to share their stories. And so they're dispelling stories on a lot of different levels. And then I wanted to reference one thing that Judge Pratt, you brought up, which I really appreciated, was as we get to know one another and as we, intersect with each other's communities, we have to be really careful not to focus on the symptoms. That behind those symptoms are really the root causes. And oftentimes we never get to the root causes because we're so busy trying to solve the symptom. And so we'll need another panel to have that discussion.
I'll be quick. Thank you. I'll be quick because I am really just focused on healing, and we can't get to healing if we can't have conversations, and we can't have a conversation if we're not willing to admit that there's a problem or there's some tension, but we also have to be willing to lift each other up. I mean, I talked about the young woman who met me in the aisle. I didn't say it out of anger to her when I said that she can't remain silent. I said it to empower her so that she knew that she had the right to have a voice and she had the right to be angry. We have to give people the right to have a full range of emotions, even if we're friends and kiss and hug at the end. But we have to also have more patience. I have been learning patience. I've been practicing. I've been checking the ego. And that's, I think the biggest thing is the checking of the ego. And just preparing for this panel with you all, I've learned so much, and I'm grateful for it. And I think it just makes me better for the next conversation around. There's been a lot of conversation in the thing about diversity and what it means. And I always say in my book, I wrote the judges and people who are in positions of authority have to constantly be checking, why am I responding this way when I see this thing over and over again? And I think you have to do it all the time in your relationships, with your partners, with children. You have to constantly be wondering why you're responding in particular ways, because most of the time it's our stuff and not somebody else's. And so I hope the panel leaves with this idea, the participants leave with this idea that they too, from where they stand in the marketplace, can make a change in these spaces.
I promise, Krish, I'll get to what I'm advocating for, but I want to thank everyone on this panel. This has been so much fun and the conversation has flowed so well. I'm grateful to y'all because I had a little bit of fun during one of these. Here's what I want to leave you with. Activism happens every day. And I grew up in a house with a woman who worked 2 full-time jobs, raising me on her own. No support from my dad. My mom was a single mother in every way, shape, or form. I grew up poor, okay? My mother went to San Quentin prison every month. She would do work in her community with houseless folks every couple weeks. Which means I, as a kid, normalized doing things like editing parole letters for Vietnamese incarcerated men. It happens every day. My mother was an accountant, my people. She was not a full-time activist. She didn't have a job at some sort of nonprofit think tank, whatever. Nor do I. I work with BLM. I think the last time I worked with BLM LA, it was like I had a brunch for a Japanese American organization. They're like, Kim, come to this brunch and do some political ed with us. You will have to do this at brunch. You will have to do this on a Sunday. It will happen at church, at a church barbecue. I want you to think about organizing. I want you to do it all the time. So it's deeply personal, it's relationships based, and it will take a little bit of your time. The colonialism and chattel slavery and genocide took centuries. I'm asking you for 20 minutes on a Sunday. You can do it.
Kim, thank you for giving me a better way to retire. We're leaving.
My mom retired and became a full-time organizer. She is linked up with my community and my friends. So I went to an organizing event the other day. My mother was already there holding court.
Yeah,
The embarrassment.
yeah. Unfortunately, I'm afraid I'm destined to some of that as well.
I love it. I would love it from you, but not from my mother, John.
So, you know, I actually wrote down some of the actions and what folks can do. And what I'm hearing are some themes, right? Self-reflection, looking at yourself, how you hold yourself, your identities, how you show up, right? In all of it, what gets triggered for you, and then understanding that, and how can you then take action to bridge the gap? Start with a conversation. In Grace Lee Boggs' movie, you know, the filmmaker says, Grace Lee Boggs' form of activism these days is having conversations. Conversations are powerful. Storytelling is powerful. We all have a story, right? That is incredibly powerful. Understanding the root causes, understanding that if we are being manipulated into seeing people a certain way, and looking at ourselves and how we can reach out a hand, right? Instead of waiting for someone to reach out a hand to us, having more patience. I love the activism happens every day, right? You show up and every day you have a chance to make a little bit of a change. So, so thank you for those great items. I was just informed by one of our organizers, we have a little bit of time to talk about intersectionality and maybe 3-4 minutes. And then there's also a question in the Q&A if someone wants to take a stab at that. And maybe if anybody wants to talk about, since queerness has come up, want to talk about being a double minority. Or triple, right? And intersectionality of gender and sexual, I mean, I can just go on, and sexual orientation and age and it's all that. So I'll leave it up to the panelists.
What was the question?
There's a question in Q&A, and if you have any thoughts on intersectionality and how that impacts this work, your work, or the work we need to do for community building.
I will try to jump in here. I have to admit, so I'm not multiracial, but as we had already indicated, I definitely identify as a queer person of color. But I will also say, I mean, for instance, my household is multiracial, and so things that impact across racial lines impact my household. My family is multiracial. Oh my gosh, at this point, I have a large family, and so we have just like so many people from all these different places. My friend group is really multiracial. And so I think that the more you extend yourself to create deep relationships with others, even outside of, I mean, and I definitely don't want to gloss over the experience of being multiracial within, you know, a single individual, and certainly invite other panelists to speak about that. But I really also invite us to think about like how multiracial our experience and our love our group is, right? Those group of those that we love. And the fact that as you think about that, then, you know, don't dissociate this person you love who's this type of something from the things that impact people who's that type of something, right? So like my partner is an immigrant person, for instance, and I should not dissociate him from the plight of you know, the immigrant experience, right? I shouldn't say, oh, well, as long as he's fine, or as long as everything's okay with him, then I don't have to worry about that. No, actually, I should be more sensitive to those things that are of importance to him, and I realize that in some cases, those things extend beyond him to a whole community of folks. And you start to think about that, then there's all sorts of identities, including what identity that you end up having ties to that you care about, and begin to see such like a much more inclusive identity for yourself.
as this is the first time I've ever had to say this as the only non-queer person on the panel. It's the funniest thing to say. I think so much of how I was raised made sure that when I got on the bench, I made sure that the court was a safe space. And I write about going to one of my mother's adoptive daughter's homes. And it was back then, she wasn't transgender. That was an evolution of the word. And I remember my mother just having this adoptive daughter. I remember in my mother's beauty salon, one of her clients would come and he was transitioning till he became she. And everyone in the beauty salon knew to respect that, not to mumble, not to say anything, because that was my mother's client and it was a safe space for everyone. And so much of, again, this idea that we learn things, and then when we get into these positions of authority, we forget to bring our wholeness and to create these spaces. And so for me, the court was just this space where, I remember one of my young lesbian women came in and she was hard work and she just kept picking up these silly drug charges. And she brought a girlfriend to court. And I was like, oh, you can't afford her. She's got Beyonce taste. You've got supermarket money. But being able to have this conversation as an authority, as an elder in this community, like, no, this is why you're getting in trouble. But I had to identify with her and like, oh no, the same way I would have given a young man some advice about that. So I just think that not being afraid to have those conversations, not being, and I smiled because she was like, you're right, Judge, you're right, because this is what's driving me into the system. And it was just like an older sister having those conversations, but we got so stuck in these positions. And I was like, I'm going to use everything that I'm given here. And when they tell me to go home, I've got skills to pay my bills, so I'll go do something else. But really being able to just really see people and wanting to change their situation because they're another human being, and not because, you have some power over them or you don't understand the community. No. And then teaching the people, when you have the authority to teach the people around you, so what do we name people? Why did you bring her out here with the dudes? Bring her back, and then the officers learning and having, what do you want the judge to call you? What do you want? What are those things? So for me, it just feels a lot easier than people want to make it, to live in places where you ensure that people's dignity and respect exist. Like that's the priority. Let's start there. And so let's just start there.
I love what you're saying, because I think I'm going to answer also the question in the Q&A is, how do we talk to younger folks who are mixed race or queer or disabled? And to me, intersectionality, the way I understand Kimberly Crenshaw's work, is intersectionality is about the things that we miss, right? It's about the fact that the law wasn't really able to contain the fact that people were both women and Black.
Mhm.
And so intersectionality at its core is not about this is this on top of this and race on top of class on top of gender on top of disability. It's actually about what did you miss and how did that change the dynamic? And how does that change the system that you're living in and engaging with, right? And so for me, when it comes to how do we engage with disability? How do we engage with trans? Give people the space to tell you what it is that they want or need from you. And I think that is the lesson of Asian American unity with Black folks. It is, oh no, I'm a monoracial Asian person. I am Vietnamese for generations, right? I'm not gonna be able to tell anybody else on this call what you want or need, what your political demands will look like, how I will improve life for you without asking you that question first. We let the young folks drive, and the kids are all right. Like, I've got nieces and nephews and nibblings, and they know what they want, and they will tell you if you ask, right? The same way that I, as a cisgender person, am led by what trans folks need in this moment. I've been doing queer and trans advocacy work, movement building, and organizing for a very long time, and things look very bleak. But the thing that has never changed never change, is we know what we're fighting for.
Hmm.
All you got to do is ask.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely love you saying that, Kim. And in fact, I'm a little embarrassed to even follow it. But I will say, I mean, coming again into the university setting, if you're on the job market now to become a professor, you end up having to do these diversity statements. And you have to talk about like how it is that you're going to address all these issues of diversity. And one of the theme of my diversity statement is actually what I do to tackle issues of diversity and inclusion is to tackle issues of power and to model as the professor in my classroom what it means to give power up, to create power for others. And the most important thing I can do to enhance diversity and inclusion in my classroom is not to try to remember all the different terms and all the different people and all the different histories and all that stuff, but is to create the environment where my students can be heard, my students can demand, my students can challenge, my students have the space to create the very unique dynamic. I mean, I can learn all the different things about categories, and then I'll meet somebody who is in that category and they don't even identify or want to be handled in that way. But what's important is that they're able to say, this is how, that they have the power and the process in place to protect their abilities to do that. And so I think modeling how to use power, but also to figure out how to use that power to disperse it. The more power all of us have, then we can stop trying to figure out how much power we have to give to others and what we need to do to allow people space. People can come in and claim their space. I don't have to give you as much space when I don't keep for myself the power of divvying out where space belongs. And so I think, to me, I mean, everything that you were saying, Kim, I just kept thinking about that and about that as a theme of how we can handle some of these situations when we're figuring out young people who are finding their voice. How can we support them, give them their voice? In fact, actually just stop trying to take it from them. They already have their voice.
Right. And I think I really like that you came to power, Kwan, because that's what white supremacy is about, right? Going back to the beginning of our conversation, white supremacy is about power, and who gets to hold it, who gets to wield it, and on whom it is wielded or exerted. That's really awkward wording, but you get what I mean, right? I think we forget that in our daily interactions when we're all feeling pressed down and burdened and feeling frazzled and things like that. And so I really want to emphasize that we need to look at the structural issues in order to work towards dignity for all of us, in order to make sure we treat people well, and that we can develop relationships and connections, because really this work is done in relationship. Pain is caused in relationship, but healing also occurs in relationship, right? That's what I've learned as a psychologist. Relationships wound and they provide healing, right? And so thank you all. This has been amazing discussion. I am so honored that I got to moderate this panel. You all have brought such wisdom and such wonderful insights. And I also see that in the chat, there has been a really robust discussion, and some of the questions our panelists might have been answered by, some our attendees might have been answered by other attendees. So this has been great. And I'm going to bounce it back to Donna.
Thank you very much. Oh my goodness, I could barely keep up with the chat. It really has been quite dynamic. Thank you all so much for your honesty and of course your wisdom and experience in sharing that with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Segal, for moderating and navigating, sometimes a very complex conversation. And of course, our Fordham University AAPI Alumni Affinity chapter. I also would like to thank our audience. And I appreciate their participation and important questions and comments. Thank you for all of that. And so just in closing, I wanted to remind everyone of some of the activities we have coming up. I'll invite all of you to join us for our Juneteenth celebration on Monday, June 19th. It will be in person here at NJPAC. We'll first have poetry and music at the Harriet Tubman Square, and then we'll have a parade back to NJPAC for an amazing panel discussion, followed by a Juneteenth marketplace. So it's going to be a full day of wonderful events. We also have just launched our Arts Exchange program, which is produced by our Community Engagement Department. And on May 24th, there'll be a storytelling and playwriting workshop. I'm sure you've all heard about our North to Shore statewide festival that takes place in 3 cities in New Jersey: Newark, Atlantic City, and Asbury Park. And that starts June 7th through the 25th. And for all of our aspiring artists, our Arts Education Summer Program registration is open, and we welcome everyone. No one is turned away from NJPAC's Arts Education Program. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.